72 hours ago, the Henderson family ventured into Pine Hollow Forest. They haven't been seen since. This is their story. Emily Henderson hurried through the crowded sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear, dodging pedestrians as she tried to keep her voice steady. "David, we can't do this. It's insane." Her heart raced as she thought about what they were planning to do. David's voice crackled through the speaker, the connection barely holding. "We don't have a choice, Em. The bank's closing in. Uncle Jack's cabin is our last hope." Emily paused, stepping into a quiet alleyway, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But what about the rumors? The disappearances? The things people say they've seen?" David sighed on the other end, trying to sound confident. "They're just stories, Em, urban legends. We'll be fine. We have to be." As Emily made her way back home, the city's noise seemed to fade into the background, her mind consumed by doubt. When she finally entered their small apartment, she found Sarah hunched over her laptop, the screen casting a cold blue glow across her face. "Hey, sweetie, what are you up to?" Emily asked, trying to sound cheerful. Sarah looked up, her face pale and eyes wide with concern. "Mom, have you seen this? There's a whole online community dedicated to Pine Hollow Forest. People go missing there all the time. And some of them, they never come back." Emily's heart sank further. "Sarah, those are just internet stories. You know how people like to scare themselves with ghost stories. Don't believe everything you read online." But Sarah shook her head, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not just stories, Mom. There are news reports, eyewitness accounts. Look at this." She turned the laptop toward Emily. On the screen, a grainy video played, showing a terrified hiker running through dense forest. His breath came in ragged gasps as he glanced over his shoulder, his panicked voice crackling through the speakers. "Something's out here. It's not human. If anyone finds this, stay away from Pine Hollow." The video cut off abruptly, the screen fading to black. Emily swallowed hard, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to close the laptop. "Sarah, I don't want you watching stuff like this. We're going, and that's final. Now pack your things." The Hendersons' car wound its way along the narrow gravel road deep within Pine Hollow Forest, the trees towering overhead like ancient sentinels. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. David gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white while Emily sat beside him, fidgeting with her phone, the signal bars stubbornly refusing to appear. In the back seat, Sarah sat in eerie silence, her eyes fixed on the passing trees, each one seeming more menacing than the last. After a long stretch of silence, Sarah broke it. "Dad, why didn't you ever bring us here before?" Her voice was small, almost lost in the sound of the tires crunching over gravel. David's jaw tightened, a muscle in his cheek twitching. "It's complicated, sweetie. Uncle Jack and I had a falling out years ago, but that's all in the past now." Emily turned to him, her voice edged with curiosity and concern. "David, you never told me about a falling out. What happened?" David sighed, the weight of old memories pressing down on him. "Jack changed after our parents died. He became obsessed with the forest, talking about ancient spirits, old gods, and dark energies. He started spending more and more time out here, alone. I thought he was losing his mind." The cabin loomed before them, weathered and worn, its once bright paint now a peeling, faded gray. The windows were dark, reflecting the last rays of sunlight, as if hiding something within. As they stepped out of the car, the forest fell silent. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press down on them, watching their every move. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her as she stared up at the cabin. "Dad, I don't like this place. Can't we just go home?" David forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It'll be fine, sweetie. We're here to make new memories, remember?" Good memories. As they unloaded their bags, a faint sound drifted through the trees, almost like a scream, but distant, muffled by the dense foliage. Emily froze, her heart pounding as she listened. "David, did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, his face pale. "Probably just the wind. Come on, let's get inside." The interior of the cabin was musty, the air thick with the scent of old wood and decay. Years of disuse were evident in the thick layer of dust covering everything. Old photographs lined the walls, their once vibrant colors faded to sepia tones. The faces in the photos were solemn, their eyes almost lifelike in their intensity. Sarah approached one of the photos, wiping away the grime with her sleeve. "Dad, is this Uncle Jack?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. David's breath caught as he looked at the photo. Uncle Jack stood in front of the cabin, his arm around a much younger David. But there was something off about Jack's eyes, a darkness that seemed to stare right through the photograph, as if he knew something the camera couldn't capture. "Yeah, that's him," David said quietly, his voice distant. "Come on, let's get settled in." As night fell, the family gathered around the fireplace, its warm glow offering little comfort against the encroaching shadows. Sarah scrolled through her phone, desperate for a distraction, but the screen remained blank. No signal, no internet, just an empty void where the digital world should be. Emily's hands shook as she sipped her tea, the cup rattling softly against the saucer. "David, tell me again why we're here," she asked, her voice breaking the heavy silence. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "You know why, Em. Uncle Jack's will. If we don't stay here for a week, we lose everything. The house, the savings, we can't afford not to do this." Sarah looked up from her phone, her face reflecting the flickering flames. "What happened to Uncle Jack anyway? You never talk about it." David and Emily exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, David spoke, his voice tinged with sorrow. "He disappeared 5 years ago. They searched for weeks, but never found a trace. Not even a footprint." Sarah's eyes widened, fear creeping into her voice. "And we're staying in his cabin. Dad, that's creepy." "It's just an old cabin, Sarah. Nothing more," David said, though his tone was less convincing than he hoped. Emily stood up abruptly, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. "I need some air. I'm going to step outside for a moment." David looked concerned, his protective instincts kicking in. "Be careful, Em, don't go far, and shout if you see anything strange." Emily stood on the porch, taking deep breaths of the cool night air, trying to steady her nerves. The forest loomed before her, a wall of impenetrable darkness that seemed to swallow the world beyond the clearing. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she thought she saw movement among the trees. A figure, tall and misshapen, seemed to be watching her from just beyond the tree line. Her heart raced, every instinct telling her to go back inside. But something held her in place, a strange pull she couldn't resist. Squinting, she tried to make out details. The figure took a step forward, and in the faint moonlight she caught a glimpse of a face, gaunt, hollow-eyed, with a twisted smile that was all too familiar. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. The figure raised a hand, beckoning her. Emily took a step forward, then another, drawn by a force she couldn't explain. The forest seemed to part before her, the trees leaning away as if to clear her path, welcoming her into its depths. Inside the cabin, Sarah looked up from her phone, a sudden unease settling over her. "Dad, where's Mom?" David frowned, his heart skipping a beat. "She went outside for some air. I'll go check on her." He opened the door, calling out into the night. Emily, where are you?" Silence answered him. The porch was empty, the forest still and watchful, the trees now pressing closer, as if they had moved while no one was looking. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night, louder, closer, unmistakably Emily's voice. It echoed through the trees, a sound of pure, raw terror that sent shivers down their spines. Sarah dropped her phone, her eyes wide with fear. "Dad, what's happening? Where's Mom?" David's face went pale as he stared into the darkness, his mind racing. "Sarah, stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "Dad, no! Don't leave me alone!" Sarah cried, grabbing his arm. But David was already moving, his mind set, flashlight in hand. "I have to find her, Sarah. I'll be back soon, I promise. Just stay inside." He stepped off the porch, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness like a knife. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the pounding of his heart. "Emily! Emily, where are you?" David called, his voice trembling with desperation. A rustling sound came from his left, and he swung the flashlight around, the beam landing on a shadowy figure. It was Emily, or at least it looked like her. She stood still, her back to him just at the edge of the light's reach. "Emily." David's voice was cautious, unsure. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond, didn't move. David took a step closer, the light illuminating more of her form. Her clothes were torn, her hair disheveled, and something was wrong with her posture. She was too rigid, too still. "Em?" David's voice cracked as he stepped closer still, the flashlight now revealing her face. It was Emily, but her eyes were vacant, staring straight ahead, unseeing. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, one that didn't belong on her face. "David," she whispered, her voice hollow, empty. "I've seen him. Jack. He's here. With me." David's blood ran cold as he reached out to her, his hand trembling. "Emily, we need to go back to the cabin. You're not well." But before he could touch her, she turned and walked into the forest, disappearing into the darkness without another word. "Emily, wait!" David shouted, but she was already gone, swallowed by the shadows. He stood there frozen in fear, unsure of what to do. The forest seemed to close in around him, the darkness thickening, the air growing colder. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Dad, something's wrong. I can feel it. We need to leave. Now." David turned back to the cabin, his mind racing. "Get inside, Sarah. We'll leave as soon as I find your mother." But as he spoke, a cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a low, guttural whisper. "David." He froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice was familiar but twisted, distorted. It was Jack's voice, but it wasn't. It was coming from all around them, from the trees, the shadows, the very air itself. "David." The voice repeated, closer now, more insistent. "Dad, please." Sarah's voice was trembling, tears streaming down her face. David turned to her, his heart breaking at the sight of her fear. "Get inside, Sarah. I'll be right there." But before he could move, the whispering grew louder, more voices joining in, all calling his name, all in Jack's voice. "David, David, come to us." The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out, the shadows growing darker, deeper. David felt something cold brush against his arm, and he jerked away, his flashlight flickering. "Dad, run!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers, now a chorus of voices, all urging David to come to them, to join them. In a panic, David turned and ran, back toward the cabin, toward the light, the only sanctuary in the oppressive darkness. But the forest seemed to shift around him, the trees bending and twisting, blocking his path, forcing him deeper into the woods. Behind him, Sarah's scream echoed through the night, a sound of pure terror that cut through the whispers, the darkness, the cold. "Sarah," David shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos, the forest swallowing him whole. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the twisted smile of his brother, Jack, watching from the shadows, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. 72 hours later, search parties found the Hendersons' abandoned car and the empty cabin. Of the family, no trace was ever found. If this story sent shivers down your spine, make sure to subscribe and share. Your support helps us dive deeper into the unknown. Stay close. The forest is always watching.